I mean, listen, forgive me for being harsh, but I'm just not sure if you actually want a healthy marriage. I mean, you might say you do, but for most of us, it's just words. Because most of us don't even know what a healthy marriage consists of. I didn't. Do you? Andy Stanley says, saying I do doesn't mean you can. Anyone can make a promise. Few can work towards keeping it. Anyone can fall in love, but what does it take to stay in love? 50% of marriages never find out. Which camp are you going to be in? Because commitment and faithfulness in marriage is about way more than simply staying together. It's about working towards a healthy relationship with each other. Are you doing that? Or do you just complain like I did? Because it's far easier to just complain. It's way easier to just blame him for what's wrong with the marriage. It's easier to just come up with excuses on why you've already done enough. And you're not doing X until they do Y. Or it's easier just to not think about any of this stuff at all, right? I mean, it's easier to just pretend that you know what's best and your wife is just overreacting. But both of you have to realize that when you give up intentionally or unintentionally, when you pull away, the marriage suffers. I mean, you can give up and let your marriage die, or you can move it in a healthier direction. You can't do both. You can't save your marriage through neglect. And I get it, you've tried. I get it, you're exhausted. You're tired of putting up with it. You feel like all she does is complain and criticize. Nothing you do will ever be good enough. You're always the bad guy, right? I understand that feeling. Or you feel like he's so emotionally distant, he's so avoidant, he's so oblivious. He doesn't even realize that he's neglecting you and hurting the marriage, does he? And you have every right to be upset. But if you say you actually want a healthy marriage, you can't give up. If you want a healthy marriage, that requires both of you. Both of you need to have a desire to actually hear the other person's perspective, to value it, to honor it, to make space for it, to shut up long enough for them to explain it. And then instead of correcting them, or arguing with them, or interrupting them, or making excuses, try to listen and actually ask questions to explore how they're feeling. Do they feel unappreciated? Do they feel like the bad guy? Do they feel hopeless? Do they feel abandoned? Do they feel like you're calling them a failure? Do they feel neglected? Have you ever asked those questions? Do you care? Because a healthy marriage cares. And I believe you that you're trying. But for most of you, you need to stop doing what's not working. I mean, nothing seems to be working, right? Then the last thing you should do is to continue doing what's not working. Don't keep having the same fights. Don't keep having the same arguments that lead to the same disconnection. Be open to admitting that you don't know everything about marriage. And then be willing to try something new. Because the sad reality is, even if I gave you new information, that wouldn't necessarily help you. Because most of us are so stubborn and self-righteous. Most of you don't want to fix your marriage. It's easier to just feel like you're the good guy and they're overreacting. It's a lot harder to admit that maybe I've unintentionally neglected you or this marriage in some way. It's a lot harder to admit that maybe I've contributed to this negative cycle. Most of you don't need new information. You need a new desire of service and sacrifice in your marriage. You need a new perspective of what your goals are in this marriage. Goals like intimacy and friendship and connection and trust. Goals like empathy and vulnerability and humility. Are those your goals? Men, those things are pillars of what makes a marriage healthy and successful. They're essential. They're not optional. The presence of them is why your marriage will succeed or fail. And not working towards those isn't simply a matter of opinion. It's neglect. And I know you don't believe that, but it's true. And yet most of us almost spend no time researching or figuring out what intimacy even is. And yet every divorce had an absence of it in some capacity. So both of you, rededicate yourself to these things. Learn about them and how they impact your marriage. Have the courage to ask your spouse about their importance to them and which ones they would like to work on the most. And then have the wisdom to close your mouth and simply listen to how you can love them better. It's not a secret what makes a marriage great. It's just hard. It's hard to be intentional. It's hard to serve them. It's hard to love them in the way that they feel loved the most and not just do it the way that we want to do it. It's hard to prioritize someone over yourself. It's hard to submit to them. It's hard to anticipate their needs. But there are few marriages that fail due to an abundance of intimacy and friendship and trust and respect and emotional connection. There are billions of marriages that have failed due to a lack of those things. Don't be one of them. Love requires growth and change, not just in your partner, but in yourself. And rarely will any of us take our eyes off of our partner's sin to focus on what we need to do differently. Love requires us to self-reflect first. Love requires us to take an honest look at how we're conducting ourselves in this marriage. Are we contributing to the destructive cycles of conflict that we're stuck in? Are we being critical? Are we yelling? Are we name-calling? Are we blaming? Are we getting defensive? Are we making excuses? Are we making conflict more peaceful or more chaotic? Are we actually listening to understand our spouses? Are we trying to understand their perspective? Are we creating a safe place for our spouses to be vulnerable and share something that's bothering them, even if it's about us? If something's important to them, is it actually important to us? And just as important, are we holding our spouse accountable for their patterns and behaviors that only destroy trust and closeness and emotional safety in this marriage? Because love doesn't sweep things under the rug that threaten those things. Love doesn't tolerate emotional or physical abuse. Love doesn't sweep contempt or pride under the rug. Love calls sin, sin, not out of condemnation, but because sin only leads to death. And that's not what either person wants for this marriage. And love apologizes, something most men, including myself, are terrible at. I mean, when's the last time you actually apologized for anything in your marriage? Because let me tell you a secret, you unintentionally hurt her more than you know. And most men never know where to start, right? I would start with that. I'm so sorry for all the times I unintentionally hurt you or neglected you and didn't even realize it. There isn't a woman alive that wouldn't like to hear that, because it shows that you're invested, that you care about her and her concerns and her hurts and even her complaints. It shows her that you love her. That's how love is demonstrated. And then love forgives. And if we're honest, some of us don't want to do that, because then we can't blame them, can we? We can't blame them for our bad attitude. We can't blame them for our selfishness. We can't blame them for our bitterness and resentment that we've held on to. We can't blame them for our toxic reactions. Forgiveness feels like we're giving them a pass, but we're not. We're just not allowing their sin to take root in our heart. We're forgiving them because of how much we believe we've been forgiven by God. Bottom line, stop doing what's not working. Stop contributing to any destructive patterns or behaviors that we can all fall into. And then learn about what builds instead of destroys intimacy and closeness and friendship in your marriage. It's not easy. It's just necessary. And for the people who say, well, I'm doing those things, but my spouse won't. I get that, but you can't control them. The only thing you can control is your responses and your reactions and the way you communicate. Absolutely, it takes two for a marriage to thrive, but it only takes one to steer it in a healthier direction. It takes one to break the toxic cycle and move towards transparency and self-awareness and emotional maturity. It only takes one to say, I care about you more than any fight that we might have. It only takes one to cultivate a climate of connection and closeness and communication, to invite and encourage them to share whatever's on their heart. Men, this is what we promised on our wedding day. This is what those vows mean. It's time that we start doing it. We all want to be the leader in this family. Why don't you try being the lead servant? Be the lead apologizer, be the lead confessor, be the lead repenter. Start having intentional talks about how to grow and strengthen and deepen your bond together. You always complain you don't know what she wants from you. This is what she wants. Are you willing to try it? Or were you just complaining for no reason? Because all men want more sex and less fighting in their marriage. Few are willing to walk the paths that actually lead there. This is that path. Humility, service, self-reflection, learning about emotional connection. Of course it sounds stupid, but guess what? You married a woman. It doesn't sound stupid to her. So if you plan on staying married to one, you need to learn about this stuff. Because men love to say, well, I think my marriage is fine. I mean, she's the one that has the problem. Well, then you have a marriage problem because she's 50% of it. You aren't the entire marriage. The goal isn't for both of you to just limp along in your marriage. It's not a success to simply stay married for 50 years, but you couldn't care less about each other. The goal is a mutually fulfilling marriage filled with intimacy and friendship and trust and great sex. That's what you hoped for all those years ago, and it's possible, but it requires something from you. Only certain paths lead to that destination, and few of us are walking them. So start creating environments of appreciation and admiration and affection. Remember, unexpressed appreciation will be interpreted as entitlement. And men, non-sexual affection goes a really long way towards eventual sexual affection. It's not a mystery, it's just cause and effect. And don't forget, real trust is built in the small moments. It's the little things that have the biggest impact in our marriages. It's the consistent, seemingly meaningless moments that build the most trust, where true safety is found. The small moments where you choose listening over arguing or correcting. The small moments where you choose to help her with the mutual chores. The small moments where you move in their direction and you think about anticipating their needs, wants, and desires from a place of love, not just obligation. The small moments where you talk about what's important to them, how they feel most loved, what makes them feel neglected. I mean, are you actually listening and practicing humility and selflessness in those areas? Because that is what creates depth in your relationship. That's what creates trust and intimacy and friendship. That creates the bond that weathers the marital storms that everyone will face eventually. This is what makes the difference between a marriage that survives and thrives versus one that dies. And the absence of these things isn't simply ignorance or mindlessness. It's neglecting the things that make a relationship a relationship. And you can still have the marriage you want and deserve, but just like anything worthwhile, it's going to require intentionality and sacrifice. And I promise you, maybe not overnight, but over time, you will realize that your marriage is absolutely worth that sacrifice. Thank you so much for watching. Can't wait to see you in the next one.